I want to talk today about salvation. What a loaded, fraught with misunderstanding term that I think you've probably heard if you've been anywhere around Christianity. And yet today I want to ask, what does salvation mean? What are we actually talking about when we say salvation? About 50, 60 years ago, the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was living over in Germany during the height of everything going on, the build-up to Nazi oppression and catastrophe, wrote this profound essay. It's called The Cost of Discipleship, in which he pondered in his society if it was possible that they had actually diluted the good news of what salvation was and had produced what Bonhoeffer very pointedly called cheap grace. Now, I can't help but wonder, as somebody navigating Christianity in American culture today, is it possible that 60 years on from Bonhoeffer's time, we are just as at risk, just as at danger for the kind of cheap grace when we don't actually stop to reflect on what salvation is and what salvation means, particularly when it comes to the restless churning we have been exploring these last couple of videos here at The Burning Word. So let's talk today about salvation and what it actually means. So here's my proposal. If we're going to dive deeper into salvation, we actually have to slow down and start with sin itself. Sin, just like salvation, is kind of trickier than you think. It's one of those words that the more you say it, the more you start to wonder, do I really know what this word even means? I mean, I think sin is intuitive. Most of us know and feel when we hear this term sin, like there is something wrong, there are things we've done wrong, like clearly there is some distance or gap or corruption of what this intended relationship between ourselves and God was meant to be. But if we push into sin itself, I think one of the places that the gospel can get thin or cheap is when we only leave sin at the surface of debt. Language and imagery surrounding debt. This is probably how you've heard sin and salvation presented to you. There is lots of debt language in Paul's writing, so it's definitely there in the Bible, make no mistake, and I'm not saying that sin is not debt. But when we stop at debt, sin is presented as debts that have been incurred against God, and salvation is quite simply the payment or the forgiveness, the wiping away of those debts. You've probably heard this. This was how I was presented the gospel in my youth group. I was invited after hearing the good news that, first bad news, I had debt, like a lot of debt as a junior hire, right? All the debts had been incurred. Good news, God had sent his son to pay the debts. So the son was there. Son, through his death on the cross, the blood was going to cleanse, pay through the debts. It's really strong tracking so far. And all I needed to do was, just like any debt repayment, I needed to receive it, right? I needed to accept the gift through faith for the payment of my debts. Now, I want you to hear from me. That is a great place to start. That is a wonderful place to start. The Bible talks about it that way. Paul is very clear that through the cross, Christ has repaid the debts of our sin. And incredibly, if you pray a prayer by faith in Jesus Christ, then there is this biblical assurance that washes over you that your debts are now paid through Jesus' death and resurrection on the cross. It's wonderful. What great and reassuring news. However, I'm already concerned that most of us breathe that deep sigh of relief, and then we stop. We stop right there at this payment of debt, this transaction. In fact, it's very capitalistic of us to think that if we just do this exchange with God, a one and done type deal, then finally everything else is going to take care of itself. But like anything you buy, like any debts you pay, the payment of the debt itself cannot be the end of the story. There surely is more going on. And so I think the next step to take, if we start with debt, is to press into another image that the Bible gives us to sin and to salvation, which is bondage. The imagery around bondage. And you'll often hear Paul say, you used to be chained or actually enslaved to sin. Paul is borrowing Israel's story here. He's taking us all the way back to Egypt, where the Israelites were bound by foot and chain to Pharaoh's rule. And in their bondage, they were required to work, to build, to toil, to suffer, to die even for a cause, for directions that were not their own. This is a very powerful, powerful image. And it's worth slowing down and asking, is sin bondage? Does that make sense? And anything I've read on our neuropsychology, anything I've gotten into when it comes to the DSM-5, mental health, struggles with everything from depression to deeper psychoses, all the way, especially into work, if you've done anything around addictions, reading on addictions, struggled with addictions yourself, you would agree with Paul that there seems to be some internal bondage to behaviors that can be self-destructive. We don't just do things once. We find ourselves repetitively churning until we become quite literally bound to these behaviors, to these habits, to these addictions. And so what Paul is telling us, that is surely good news, much as repayment of our debt is good news, is that when it comes to God, and when it comes to what Jesus has offered, in the cross of Christ, not only is debt repaid, but a bondage to sin has been severed. Paul will say, your debt has been repaid and your bondage has been released. You are no longer enslaved to sin. This surely is good news, but let me push you further still. If you only still stop here, I think we still have this confusing picture of what salvation is, because though it is relieving to think your debt has been repaid, and surely it has, though it is now wonderful to hear that your bondage has been released, you're no longer chained, you're no longer enslaved to this old master, you now have new freedom in Jesus Christ. The problem for most of us when it comes to our salvation is why then in freedom we continue to return to the behaviors, to the actions, to the desires that we used to be enslaved to. Now, I think when we finally get to that question, like why are we still as Christians returning to old sins? That is where we start pressing into some even deeper possibilities of the scope and meaning of what salvation is intended to be. So let me offer you one more image. The first image is debt. The second image is bondage. The third image that is a little bit subtler in Scripture and is one of the reasons why I think we so often miss it is the imagery of our disease when it comes to sin. Sin as a condition, sin as a sickness, sin as a disease. Now, if you move through these layers of imagery, the first image of debt is highly transactional. The second image of bondage is highly tense. There's a struggle, and it's really focused on mastery, direction, and the opportunity of freedom. Like, do you have to do it? The third imagery of disease gets into the infected condition of our very internal being. It's like if you think about cancer, just the terribleness and tragedy of what cancer is. Cancer infects your cells. You cannot see it most of the time until it is too late. But it is hidden, it is residing, and it is, of course, generating that which you have no control over. I think this is why sin as disease is quite a challenging and difficult concept for us to wrestle with, because most of us don't want to think that there is some power at work within us, some sort of hidden, almost microscopic force that is doing work from the inside. And yet, if you think about any time you've been sick, if you think about any kind of fatal condition, if you even just think about your life itself, we all, of course, live under the shadow of mortality. We live with the reality that these bodies we are in are frail, and forces that are outside our own control are eventually going to break our bodies down to the point that we can no longer do. We can no longer think. We can no longer act in the way that we want. This, I think, is why the Bible will explore in Psalm 41, for instance, that it's not just a behavior that needs to be addressed. Like, God actually needs to heal us. Jeremiah 17 is another perfect example of this. Jeremiah says, the heart, the very interior of who we are, like the very depths of your being, is sick. It is sick. Who can understand it? Who can heal it? And when Jesus finally comes, what is one of the great images that Jesus offers us of himself? He says, I am the physician. I have not come to heal those who are well. I have come to heal those who are sick. So in this imagery of disease, I think we finally get to the condition itself, the reason why we are still, even on the other side of faith, even on the other side of salvation, as an act of faith in Jesus Christ, as the reception of a gift of what God has offered to us. We find in this image of disease that there is a deeper transformation, something from the inside out that needs to be worked. You might be wondering at this point, like, where am I going with this? What is the point? What's this better gospel that's not cheap? What's this new invitation if the point is that a thin gospel leads us to a transactional moment? Like, what is salvation, right? This is the question driving why we are digging into these very problematic images of sin. Well, here's where I think the tradition of the church actually offers us some incredible riches we need to recover. One of the ways that the Christians early on would talk about our faith was not just the transaction of debt, but was actually an inner transformation of our very desires themselves. St. Augustine, whom I love, was especially good at this. We've been looking at how Augustine frames our hearts as restless until they find rest. It's like Augustine is saying, your heart is being pulled, it's being twisted. Your heart has even already been shaped by the many sins you've participated in, the many desires that have gone astray. We've talked about power, right? Power is this incredibly destructive, difficult, unruly thing to manage, because as soon as you get it, you so easily are pulled with desires back into yourselves. You're so easily pulled to be interested in you, to use your power, to meet your own needs, to heal your own inner complexities. But the vision of salvation, for those of us who have power, must reckon with power, is that salvation says God wants to reorder your desires when it comes to power itself. Like, what if in Jesus you could become the kind of person who, when placed with power, actually turns to serve those that power has been entrusted for? Like, what if in Jesus the vision was not just to use your power for yourself, but there was enough healing, enough inner transformation that power was being redirected back and given away? I think we've seen glimpses of this, but imagine if salvation was actually about that. The same could be said for sexuality. I think so often the struggle with sexuality is that we've been living with all of these churning, confusing desires, messages, and while sexuality is incredibly powerful, it's dangerous, it easily becomes manipulated, it becomes something that either hurts us or something that can hurt others, and we get lost in this dance of interrelational confusion where sex is this like push and pull of pleasure and power. And instead, what if in Jesus could actually heal those very desires within you? What if instead of needing sex, what if instead of using sex, what if sex could become a holy encounter of mutual love and self-sacrifice? Like, what if the very image of Jesus on the cross, offering himself freely out to us, is the reordering picture that helps to heal how you and I approach sexuality, that helps to heal your very desires themselves? This begins to become a very grand and almost overwhelming thought. In fact, I think one of the best modern authors on this was C.S. Lewis, who in all kinds of ways wrestled with this salvation imagery that was not just about our debts, but actually was about the inner transformation of our very selves. C.S. Lewis would talk in his famous sermon called The Weight of Glory by saying, we cannot imagine the creatures that we are actually exchanging pleasantries with on a day-to-day basis. Like, you think you're talking to your neighbor or your coworker, but you are actually standing before either someone who, if they were to truly follow their darkest desires, would be a very expression of evil in hell itself, or someone who, if they could be saved, if they could walk with Christ through the refining fires of his death and into his resurrection, they could become a saint unlike anything you could possibly imagine. Lewis could see that the goal of the Christian life was not simply to get into heaven. Instead, the goal of the Christian life was to become the saint, the fully sanctified and transformed, the inside out, healed, freed, empowered lover of God and other people that you were intended and created to be. Can you imagine what kind of salvation you could step into if the gift of God's love in Jesus Christ, the debt that was paid, the bondage that's been released, could lead to your whole inside out interior transformation of you not just doing the right things, but the very motivations and desires of your heart being right with God, for God. Like, imagine that kind of healing. Now, the struggle is, even as I envision this with you, as we imagine the saints we could become, the struggle is we live this side of eternity. We live still with restless hearts. We live still with the sickness of our condition and disease. I think that's why we need to get all of these imageries back into the equation when it comes to salvation. Because here's the good news. Salvation tells you that simply by faith in Jesus, you will be drawn into the full and radical transformation of your heart. Like, you are pointed in that direction. It is being pulled forth. It's being worked out. God's very Spirit is guiding and drawing you towards the full transformation that God intends for you. However, salvation also reminds us we're really not there yet. There is work still to do. There is a path still to walk. There is a journey before you. If you are going to move from the bondage you experienced in Egypt, it's like you've been freed of those chains, like you've been released. You're now going to have to move through the wilderness to get to the glory that God intended you. And here's the thing. No one you know or meet will yet be fully transformed, which means you yourself will also not yet be fully transformed. And you're going to have to bump and bounce around in between all of these half-completed saints. In that work, Augustine's final picture for us is one of a pilgrimage to an eternal city, to God's city. And one of the reasons why Augustine loves to draw on this image over and over and over again is that it signifies your salvation is being worked out right now. Like, every day-to-day encounter you have, the opportunities you have to sift through your interior motivations, to work out your desires, to confess your sins, to discover that that thing which you thought was really maybe trying to be offered for other people was actually about you this whole time. These are the moments where salvation is being purified. It's like a gold that's being refined. It's like a radical transformation of that which used to be sort of rough and cut and hewn into the most distinguished of marble statues. This is the work God is doing within you, even now. And this actually is the point of salvation itself. To journey forth on this path, you are going to need fellow travelers. This is the company of saints who are in between. They will frustrate you, they will infuriate you in your salvation, but you will need them because they also will refine you. You need to know where you are traveling. So one of the great gifts Christianity keeps telling us over and over and over again is to look up and see the hope that is God, to look up and see the hope that is eternity itself, to look up and see the hope that Jesus has secured for you, that which you are working out right now. It's all still true. Salvation is still true. It is a fact. Like, the debt has been paid. The chains have been snapped. But in this working out Augustine encourages us, though we feel restless now, there is a great rest waiting for you if you can journey on with others, if you can hold on to faith. One of my favorite images from Augustine's preaching actually comes when he's working through the Gospel of John. He says, the Christian life is something like finding yourself cast out at sea and clinging to the driftwood that is the cross. I think our salvation, rather than a transaction that's done, is something closer to a clinging to Christ in faith, a clinging to God's love, a clinging to the very hope of our eternity, where all of these stormy waters will one day be at peace. The encouragement to you today is to know, if you feel restless, if the waters are feeling choppy, if there's a part of you even that wants to doubt that earlier experience of faith, that moment when you prayed that prayer, like if you perpetually found yourself questioning, am I good enough? Am I Christian enough? The whole encouragement of the scriptures would be, just cling to the cross. Keep clinging to the cross. You don't actually need anything else. The restlessness in the seas are part of what we are all experiencing. Just cling to the cross and trust that Christ will be the one in your clinging to carry you to the home and the rest that God intended for you. May you become the kind of saint who journeys with others, even though they infuriate you. May you become the kind of Christian who sees heaven not just as a transaction, a destination, or escape, but as a sanctifying transformation of your whole interior being. May you become the kind of person who in the day-to-day trenches of life is working out with fear and trembling the very reworking of your heart. And may you know that God will carry you to your home, even when you fail and fall. This has been John Perrine with The Burning Word. Grace and peace.